teaches her students to read the Gospels between the lines and behind the words. There's so much meaning there, she would say, in the text, right before your eyes. And yet, quite often, we miss it. We miss it entirely. Bob, you can change the slide. Never mind. For example, all that worked right before we started service. For example, last week's reading, the crossings over the sea, if we focus more on the small picture, what was happening to people right then, when Jesus arrived at his destination, there was always plenty to concentrate on, but the bigger picture might escape your attention. Last week, we spoke of the sea as being that liminal space, that in-between space, dangerous, full of fear and the unknown. It was a place of boundaries. So what does it mean that one side of the sea was Jewish territory and the other side Gentile? Stepping into the unknown, there is tension and risk, maybe even danger. Jesus and the disciples were going somewhere less hospitable last week, less comfortable, less safe. And if you were a first century Christian, you probably would have not needed anyone to set the scene for you. Now, in the hearing of this gospel, you would have felt that the tensions as you listen to the story. Think of border crossing into North Korea or Syria or Iran today, the danger they hold and the international crisis they provoke. And what about the border crossings on our minds every day during this most recent immigration crisis, especially yesterday with all the protests? The storms and the risk are something we understand metaphorically as we face the challenges in our life as the church. Taking the risk of opening ourselves up and reaching out to the other. It wasn't an easy crossing for the disciples either. Quote, this tension runs underneath the narrative in many of the stories of Mark's gospel. After spending time on Jesus' preaching with words, Mark turns to the way Jesus preached with his actions. In a sense, showing, not just telling people what the reign of God looks like. Jesus goes back and forth across the sea, doing many works of wonder, yet not always receiving a warm reception. Another thing that runs throughout these stories is really a way of describing the reception. Faith or no faith. Faith or fearlessness, fearfulness. Faith or confusion. Or hard-headedness, or maybe even hard-heartedness. The gospel this week sits on that point between faith and fear. Faith and despair, and even faith beyond hope. There are two stories in one here. Both of them taking place on this side of the sea, the familiar side of the sea. You might say Jesus is with his people, for he has just returned from Gadarene, from the Gentile territory where he met and healed the madman. In kind, the villagers, perhaps politely, but definitely with fear, asked Jesus and his followers to leave. Quote, fear not. Rejoicing was the response of the people who witnessed the spectacular and very public healing of the man who had unclean spirits. And yet, surprisingly, they didn't flock to Jesus for more miracles and kind of just shoot him out of town. This week's passage contains two stories. Both stories involve women in crisis. In fact, we don't know them by their names, but by their needs. Both daughters of Abraham, not outsiders to begin with, but now both subject to the taboos around the mysterious power of life or blood, and even more mysterious and unconquerable, the power of death. There were those who believed that bleeding women and dead girls should be avoided, at the risk of conveying their uncleanliness to others. And of course, quote, the number 12 is significant in Jewish thought. For example, the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles. So it's no coincidence that the women had been bleeding for and cut off life for 12 years. And the little girl is 12 years old. Richard Swanson says that blood is, quote, the place that God's first breath is understood to inhabit a human being, the place also from which we give life back. He finds it intriguing that the word flow could also be translated as river, as, quote, this woman's life is swept along by a condition that persists for far too many years. In Faith and the Vulnerability of Children, Brooks Brent points out that the theme running throughout this narrative is that of faith. Faith in God despite the circumstances. Scholars have suggested that the repeated use of the number 12 for the age of the girl and the duration of the women's hemorrhaging suggests that this story is ultimately a metaphor for the faith of Israel and its 12 tribes. So, we have Jesus landing on the shore. He is mobbed. Then Jairus, a leader of the synagogue, pleads with Jesus to heal his daughter. And then Jesus moves from point A, the shore, towards point B, Jairus' house. And yet it is here in this in-between space that Jesus' cloak is touched. Not even his physical body, but just his cloak. And Jesus doesn't permit this touch to go unnoticed. He does not let it remain in an in-between space. He doesn't let it stay anonymous, something that just happens in the passing. He stops. He scans the crowd and asks, who touched me? Jesus, quote, lets himself be sidetracked by hurrying to the synagogue leader's home long enough to find the person who has reached out to him with a touch that's more specific, more intentional than just a merely jostling of the crowd. Perhaps the crowd wanted to get near a celebrity, but this woman was reaching for her life. Jesus felt both her weariness and her deep, deep hope. How could he simply walk away, knowing that she had been renewed? A miracle has happened, and again, it happened in that in-between space, that liminal space between here and there. What's the saying? Is something about it's not the destination, but the journey? This liminal space, this in-between space from point A to point B has become a place of learning, a place of healing, a destination in and of itself, a space of faith beyond hope. It is for the very reason that we need to stop and breathe and take notice. Mark is telling us where we least expect it, in our rush from point A to point B, miracles happen. The next nameless woman has just reached adulthood at 12 years old. That means the older woman has been bleeding during this girl's entire lifetime. However, an unknown illness has struck her down, and this leads her father, who in the best of ancient fashion does get a name, to seek out Jesus in his desperate search for help. We know this man is, quote, an important person, a religious leader in the synagogue. Now, since the first century, synagogues were local communal institutions. It's not surprising that there is no evidence for a centralized group that determined what took place in them. Although some scholars used to assume that the Pharisees, the likely precursors to rabbis, were in charge of the synagogues. But yet, most first century sources identify elders, priests, or archsynagogai, oh my God, my Greek is terrible, heads of synagogues. In other words, it was a group of people getting together out of passion for learning and for the Spirit and for the faith. And there might have been a person in charge, maybe not. Rabbinic leadership of synagogues, which is what we are familiar with today, was limited in the first few centuries and didn't crystallize until the medieval period. So that was not what was happening here. We have a leader of basically a slightly organized study group. And since there was no central control over the synagogues, Israel often kept its eye on them and tried to keep them in control. See, knowing he may have been watched didn't matter at this point. Quote, his precious child's illness had reduced him to falling to the ground in front of a traveling folk healer in a last-ditch effort to prevent the worst from happening. This man's name is known to us, Jairus. Megan McKenna tells us that his name in Greek is a clue to what's going to happen because it means he who will be awakened. Or he who will be enlightened. The man, in spite of risk being seen as encouraging Jesus' ministry, in spite of knowing that anything could take a person's life, and most likely at any given moment, something would. See, this was before science was able to intervene, and if you got sick, more likely than not, you died. John Pilch observes that in Jesus' time, 60% of live births usually died by their mid-teens. And this is just a fact. And many adults did not want to get too attached to their children for this reason. And for a man to seem to care so greatly for a daughter in this time is actually quite amazing. There's a quote that says, "The gift of a child must have seemed too precarious to invest in wholeheartedly. Yet this man couldn't bear to lose his little girl, even." Charles Campbell writes, quote, "At a time when daughters were not valued as much as sons." So by going to this itinerant preacher, healer, who was already in trouble with the authority like him, most likely his colleagues, and maybe even some of his friends, he risks being ridiculed. He also risks missing the last few precious moments of his daughter's life. This man was on life's journey from point A to point B. He knew what was important. He knew what was right and what was wrong. He knew the law. He knew that this Jesus was a troublemaker. He knew the talk against him, but then in the middle of his planned out life, his daughter becomes ill. In this in-between time, this unplanned time, arises fear, arises desperation, arises reevaluation. This Jesus, who was more troublemaker and a nuisance, has now become his refuge and his only hope. Then, to make it more poignant, as they are on their way from the shore to his house, even his hope dies. His servants come to tell him, "Don't bother the master, for your daughter has died." When the news arrives of his daughter's death, Jesus, Barbara Brown observes, then preaches the shortest sermon of his career. "Do not fear," he says to the grief-beset man. "Only believe." Now, there is a sermon. Don't fear, just believe. In the midst of unbelievable odds and the liminal space where fear and confusion reign, don't fear, just believe. Whatever troubles your soul, be it small or be it huge, do not fear. Only believe. When life catches you off guard and you're just trying to get from point A to point B, move forward without fear. Step boldly in belief. But remember to stop and look and listen, because something's going to happen between point A and point B. I don't think I can add any more to Jesus' words here. If you never remember anything I say or do, that's great. As long as you do what Jesus has taught us here. Do not fear, only believe. And when it's all over, and when we've gotten through whatever we need to get through, remember the last part of this gospel reading. Get up, walk, and have something to eat. You put those two together, and it makes life a little bit simpler. You just have to remember, though, sometimes we forget to get up. Sometimes we forget to breathe. Sometimes we forget to pause. Sometimes we forget to eat. Oh, please, how many have forgotten to eat in the middle of something bustling until all of a sudden you realize your sugar is going out of whack or something? Or your stomach won't leave you alone anymore. In the midst of this, I cannot help but think of yesterday when a bunch of us were out in solidarity with those who may have a great amount of fear, but they believe they are heading towards something better by coming here. And I also thought about us who stepped out in solidarity here. It's easy for us here in Petaluma to do that. I mean, in San Francisco or LA or even Sacramento. But I wonder about the people who felt called to step out in those small towns or those small cities where they might have been the only one or two. Those who stepped out because they believed in making this place better. Now, can you hit the slide one more time? Oh, look. Sorry, guys. That was just a couple of us. But as part of our call as United Church of Christ, where we're seeking out to make this a just world for all, that doesn't mean just talking about it in the church. That means getting out and doing something. Even if it's just holding a sign and walking a couple of blocks in almost 100-degree temperature. Some of us stuck to the shady side of the street. Some went on the sunny side of the street. But it's easy for us because we have food, we have water, we have shade. But those people who are coming here on that perilous journey, who are stepping out in fear, but in faith, they don't have it so good. And so we're trying to make it better for all humans. And the last thing I want to add is my favorite poster, which I don't have the big one anymore, so I made a small one of it, is there's no such thing as an illegal human. And if we serve humanity first, we can figure out the rest later. Just have faith and believe. Amen.